Okay, today we're going to start talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction. We'll try to put these together. I'll do these lectures as quickly as possible so you can finish up the the quizzes and you can get ready to take the exam. Now, last thing we talked about was the election. It's Abraham Lincoln, the abolitionist, against the three individuals who believe in a continuation of the institution of slavery. J.C. Breckinridge, who is the Southern Democrat. The Southern Democrats no longer trust the Northern Democrats, Stephen Douglas. And so they are going to separate. They're going to have become two separate parties. Now, currently, J.C. Breckinridge is the vice president with James Buchanan. Buchanan, who is a Democrat from Pennsylvania, who personally, at least publicly, says that he's against the institution of slavery. Well, personally he's against the institution, but publicly he believes the Constitution allows for this institution of slavery. So as a Northern Democrat, he still sees the continuation of the institution of slavery. And even though he lives in Pennsylvania, which is at this point a free state, J.C. Breckinridge, James Buchanan has two individuals who work for him as indentured servants. Basically, if they were in the South, they would be slaves. So the indentured servants are... it's sort of a loophole that he has. So the current president, who is a Northern Democrat, does believe in the institution of slavery continuing, but the idea is that the institution it's up to the states to administer. And then John Bell. As I said, John Bell is from Kentucky. John Bell is representing sort of all these individuals on the border states. All these individuals on the border states, because he's learned from the Southern Democrats that they plan to secede from the Union if the election goes badly. So if the election goes badly, they're planning to secede from the Union. So what happens? Well, Abraham Lincoln wins the election, but he only wins it with 39.8% of the electoral vote, or of the popular vote. He gets 180 electoral votes, which is the clear majority. However, if both of these had been combined with Stephen Douglas, especially Illinois and parts of New York, a lot of these other states would have gone to Stephen Douglas rather than to Abraham Lincoln. Stephen Douglas got 30% of the vote, and Breckinridge over 18%, and John Bell over 12%. John Bell got 39 electoral votes. Had John Bell's votes gone to Stephen Douglas, Stephen Douglas would have won the election. They would have been, well, the number of the number of popular votes would have swung the Electoral College in those directions. So it's the Republican Party comes on the scene with the goal of abolishing slavery. Okay, and as soon as the election is over, Abraham Lincoln wins. The Deep South is going to secede from the Union. Okay, on this map, we've got all of the free states are in yellow. Okay, the green states are the states that secede immediately following the election in November. By December, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas have seceded from the Union. Okay, by December. So when January rolls around, these states, it becomes common knowledge that these states have declared themselves independent. The current president, James Buchanan, who again supports a continuation of the institution of slavery, sends a ship from Washington down to South Carolina in January to investigate, to find out what's going on. as the ship starts to come into Charleston Harbor opens fire on the ship under James Buchanan's administration. The ship turns around and heads back to Washington. So why didn't that start the Civil War? Well, remember, in the election happens in November, and at this point, the president doesn't take office until March. Now it's January, but back then it was in March. So you've got 5 months of time where the old president is still the president. That's what they used to refer to as the lame duck session. The lame duck session, this period between not being president anymore and the new president taking over. By January, James Buchanan, just to be quite honest, he's been trying to maintain that sectional balance. He's been trying to, and it's been nearly impossible because neither side is willing to compromise anymore. Okay? And so during his whole presidency, he's trying to keep this balance between free states and slave states. Publicly, right, as a politician, he wants to appear neutral. He wants to appear to be the middle of the road guy. And his true feelings about slavery, most people think were politically driven. Since he is from Pennsylvania, in order to stay in Pennsylvania, he has to say that he's personally against the institution. However, he finds loopholes to maintain his servants in his household with these indentured servant contracts. James Buchanan has to decide, in these last 3 months as president, is he going to do something that is going to start a war? Is he going to be the president who is now known as the person who started the Civil War, the war between the states? And quite frankly, he decides no. The ship goes back to Washington, and Buchanan does nothing. He does nothing. He decides he'll allow Lincoln to take care of it when Lincoln becomes president. So Lincoln actually inherits a shooting war that has yet to be declared. He doesn't even go to the Congress and petition the Congress to get troops. So when Lincoln comes into office, in March, in April, he sends a ship, a supply ship, not a warship. He informs South Carolina that the ship is coming, and he sends the supply ship to South Carolina because he wants to know what the deal is. And so as they get down there, the ship unloads supplies, food and materials and clothing and blankets and things like that to Fort Sumter, and then the ship leaves, right? It's after this ship arrived that the militia of South Carolina decides they don't want the Union Navy coming to South Carolina to one of our forts. And so they attack Fort Sumter. And it's at this point, when they open fire on Fort Sumter, that Abraham Lincoln has to call for troops. He has to call for troops. Okay? We'll get into more of that. So here's what happens. He calls for troops. He requests that Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky, Indiana, and Virginia, he requests troops from these states right here. All these states, because they're close proximity to South Carolina. Now, Indiana, Ohio, they're all about sending troops. They're all about sending troops. They're ready to go. But Kentucky and Virginia and Tennessee and North Carolina, these are slave states. These are slave states. Now they're forced into a position. Do we take up arms against a state that we agree with in principle as far as their ideology, to support a government that we disagree with in principle? And so the border states now have to vote in April. whether to become a slave state or free state. Virginia is the first. Virginia will vote to secede. Virginia will vote to secede from the Union, followed by Arkansas. Then Tennessee will vote, and North Carolina will vote. Missouri and Kentucky are both slave states, but they vote to remain in the Union. They vote to remain in the Union. Now, Maryland and Delaware are both also slave states. Maryland, however, is ready to vote. They're ready to vote on secession, but Abraham Lincoln is going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and he's going to have all of the Maryland legislatures detained. He's basically going to arrest them and hold them until troops can be positioned in Maryland to stop Maryland from seceding. Was that legal? Well, no, it wasn't. And Lincoln knows that. Lincoln even says as much. However, you've got to look at it from Abraham Lincoln's point of view. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Washington, D.C., but Virginia has already seceded from the Union. If Maryland would have seceded from the Union, then the capital of the United States of America would have been here, which would have made it right in the middle of the Confederacy. The Congress, the White House, everybody would have been right there in the Confederacy. So Abraham Lincoln felt he had no choice but to occupy Maryland before they had a chance to vote for or against secession. Now, Delaware. Delaware is a slave state. Delaware wanted to secede from the Union, but they weren't going to be able to, because Maryland is occupied. New Jersey and Pennsylvania are very radical anti-slave states. If Delaware would have seceded from the Union, then Delaware would have been immediately trounced by all of its neighbors, by all the people around them. So Delaware decides not to secede from the Union. However, during the entire war, all of the Union states send units to fight in the Civil War, and they send supplies and materials, except for Delaware. Delaware sends nothing. They don't send any troops. They don't send anybody. Delaware is going to remain defiant, even though they chose to remain in the Union. We've got the same problem in Appalachian areas in the South, Tennessee and North Carolina. Tennessee, the eastern part of Tennessee, is going to vote not to secede. However, eventually they're going to be outnumbered by West Tennessee and Middle Tennessee. And so eastern Tennessee, which had its sympathies towards the Union, which would have been John Bell's territory, this constitutional Union party, and North Carolina. North Carolina came very, very close to voting not to secede until the fact that between the most militant Confederate army, South Carolina, and the largest Confederate army, Virginia, North Carolina would have been surrounded by Confederates. And if they would have voted not to secede, then North Carolina would have been trounced. So North Carolina found itself in the same position that Maryland and Delaware did. And so the people in North Carolina will reluctantly vote to secede from the Union. Now, throughout the entire Civil War, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland are slave states. That means slavery is still legal. And in those states, slavery is legal until the year 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment. I've told you guys over and over and over again, the only way to legally, according to our system of law, to eliminate the institution of slavery is to amend the Constitution. You have to amend the Constitution to get rid of slavery because it had been entrenched in the Constitution. We've discussed it. We've discussed the clause in Article 1 that recognizes the legitimacy of the institution. It also recognizes the sub-citizen status of the slave. It also, in Article 1, recognizes or guarantees that the institution will be allowed to continue, right? And then in Article 4, it guarantees that if a slave runs away from a slave state to a free state, the slave state owner is allowed to go into the free state to retrieve their property. In the Constitution, it's been entrenched. The only way to get rid of slavery is to amend the Constitution. Now, this is important. This is important because what we need to talk about now is secession. This question of whether secession was legal. Okay. Well, you guys have read the Constitution. What does the Constitution say about seceding from the Union? Does it have terms? Does it have conditions? Does it give any kind of indication as to what would be required? No. It doesn't say that you can secede from the Union. Does it forbid secession? Does the Constitution say you can't secede from the Union? You can't break away and form your own government? No, it doesn't say that. However, when Abraham Lincoln, in his speeches talking about secession, he talks about things such as an indissoluble union, a perpetual union, an eternal union. Lincoln uses this terminology. Abraham Lincoln tells the world that secession is illegal. That secession is illegal. And he says what these state governments have done is against the law. Was it? Well, it's not in the Constitution. Either way. So Lincoln is basing his ideals on this notion that we are a union of states and therefore the central government has the power. The national government has the power to coerce the state governments into staying in the union. Now this is going to become really, really confusing. This is why Lincoln fights the war. Lincoln's fighting the war to stop secession. That's his stated goals all the way up until 1863, in which point he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which changes. It adds to the reasons for the war that success in the Civil War will mean the elimination of the institution of slavery. But for the first 3 years of the war, 3 years of the war, that wasn't the purpose behind the war. The war initially started to stop secession. Now, the other question, whether or not, well, if the Constitution says nothing about secession, one way or the other, what gives the South the idea that they can secede from the Union? See, this is one thing that we haven't discussed in a while, not since, I guess, the War of 1812. But a number of occasions in U.S. history, we've had individuals and we've had states and areas, regions, that have threatened secession from the Union. The first was actually the reason it got Aaron Burr in trouble and tried for treason, because Aaron Burr wanted to get the western part of New York and some of the New England states to secede from the Union so he could form a new country. They were going to form a new country. Aaron Burr will be arrested for treason, brought back to Washington. He will be tried, but of course he would be acquitted. But that quelled that notion of secession. Okay. The second time is during the War of 1812. I don't know if you remember the Hartford Convention, where the Federalists, because of their opposition to the War of 1812, have decided to secede from the Union and rejoin England. They were going to stop being New England and return to being Old England. And so they had decided to secede from the Union just at the time when the victory of Andrew Jackson comes up, the Battle of New Orleans, and then news of the treaty had been signed, the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812. At this point, the New England secession now looks like treason because the war is now officially over and they're trying to break away from the country. The Federalists lose all of their political clout. So what gave those people the idea that secession was possible? Well, it comes in the Declaration of Independence, not in the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence, even though it's not our governing doctrine, it is the document that gives us what justifies our leaving and separating from England. Basically, it said when the central government that has been created amongst men fails to protect the rights of the individuals in that area, that the people have the right to get rid of such a government and establish one that will protect their rights. And as far as the Southerners are concerned, this attack on the institution of slavery, right? This idea that they cannot secede from the Union, that the Union is going to start a war with them over this issue, is exactly what they're talking about. For the South, this is referred to, at least early on in the writings of, I can't remember his first name. His name's Pollock. He calls this the War of Southern Independence, the War for Southern Independence. So in the South's perspective, they are fighting for independence from the Union. So Lincoln says that secession is illegal. Lincoln says secession is illegal. He has opponents in Washington who believe that secession is legitimate, that secession is legal. And it's really kind of odd because it's the members of his own party, the Radical Republicans. The Radical Republicans have to view secession as legal, especially because the Radical Republicans' primary goal throughout the entire period is to abolish the institution of slavery. Okay? Now, this is what the Radical Republicans say. They understand that the only way to eliminate the institution of slavery is to amend the Constitution. In order to amend the Constitution, you have to have 2/3 majority in the House, 2/3 majority in the Senate, and 3/4 of the states have to agree. Then the Constitution can be amended. Then they can root out those elements of slavery within the Constitution. If these southern states are legitimately still part of the Union, they have to be included. They have to be counted. However, if secession was legitimate, then these are now a foreign country. They are no longer part of the United States, and at this point we would be able to get a 2/3 majority in the Congress and a 3/4 majority in the states. There are still slave states represented who are going to vote against it, but Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware are not going to be able to wield enough political clout to help to protect the institution of slavery anymore. Now, so they have to recognize the South as being legitimate, okay? They have to recognize this secession as being legal. The problem is they recognize the fact that all of these resources that come from the South, we still need in the North. They still need in the North because as they begin industrialization, they need the coal and they need the cotton and they need the food products and they need the corn and they need the tobacco. So what the North is going to do, even though it recognizes secession as legitimate, the North is going to fight a war of conquest on the people that they claimed were legitimately separated from them, because they are not going to allow them. Even though they claim it's legitimate, they are not going to. This has to be their rationale. Because if secession is legitimate, the only reason to continue the war is because you're going to conquer those people and seize their property. Secession's a puzzling issue. And most people, the idea is, why don't we just put in the Constitution whether or not it's legal? That could have been done. It could have been viewed as an element that could have clarified everything. That could have been, you could amend the Constitution to say secession is not legitimate. However, most of the Congress wanted secession to be legitimate. That's why we still don't have an amendment to the Constitution that defines secession as illegal. It's still silent. So can a state secede from the Union today? Most people's knee-jerk reaction is no. But there's no legal basis. There's no justification for no, except for the fact that the last time they tried, an oppressive government came and defeated them. So, secession's not an easy question. Secession's not an easy question. And all of this stuff, as we view what's going on in the Civil War, we have to stop thinking of the issues involved in the Civil War as easy answer kind of issues. So, after we get finished with this, we'll go ahead and start on, we'll look at some of the aftermaths of the war and some of the unique issues that came about because of the Civil War.